Okay.
Look at these fucking idiots.
That's nice.
Go.
Off to a good start.
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome to the October 27th, 2021 meeting of the East and Reading Region 9 Joint Boards of Education, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. I am calling the meeting to order at 7:04 p.m. First on the agenda is approval of minutes from the 8/24/21 meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Devin,
Second, Cheryl.
any discussion? Seeing none, let's see if I remember this, Chris. I call the minutes.
You can deem them approved by unanimous consent.
Deem them approved by unanimous consent. Thank you very much. Moving on. Discussion and possible action, presentation of survey data. I would like to welcome Dr. Kevin Glass from EdAdvance, who has analyzed our survey data. We're going to make him a host here so he can share his screen. And let's see where I got to find you. Sorry.
And while Heather is finding his screen, I will also just echo the welcome to Dr. Kevin Glass. Kevin is the director of the Center for Program Research and Evaluation with EdAdvance. EdAdvance is one of the regional education service centers in the state of Connecticut. And we often collaborate with the RESCs in our area, both EdAdvance and CES, to support our district's activities. So welcome to Dr. Glass.
So I can't make him the host. Was there a reason I can't make him the host? Because I'm the co-host. John Stinson, you have to do that.
He doesn't.
Kevin should be able to share.
Host.
He should be able to share.
Yep. I have access.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay. So let me find the screen. Okay, so again, my name is Kevin Glass, and I work for EdAdvance. The superintendent's office of East and Reading Region 9 came to us a couple months ago with basically three tasks: to look at the climate, the DEI survey data, to give them an overview of what the data suggests and what it says, and then initially for the DEI survey, just to validate the authenticity of the data that we received and whether it was the data that was posted. So before I get into that, I do work for EdAdvance. I have been in educational research for about 20 years. My doctoral work is in psychometrics, which is in test design and analysis, and specifically around educational assessments, school climate, and needs assessments within schools. And currently working with 26 and now 28 as of this afternoon school districts, specifically on measuring school climate and what that means and how you roll the results of what you see in the school climate into an action plan to make significant changes to what's taking place there. For the instruments that we analyzed, we did not construct any of them. We did not design any of them. We were not involved in the development process of those instruments. So the analysis that I'll give you today will just be an analysis of the data that we could gather solely from the instrumentation themselves and not based upon any of the math or the development behind it. So we won't be able to do any cross tabulations. We won't be able to draw any significant correlations because we weren't the ones who actually designed the surveys. That doesn't mean the surveys aren't valid and aren't strong. I just don't know enough about their adoption to speak to a deeper statistical understanding of what's actually taking place there. So I'll break this up into two sections. That I'll deal with the DEI survey first. When I'm done explaining what we did and the results that we found from that, I'll open the floor up for a few minutes of questions. And then once we've passed through that, we'll talk about the climate surveys that we more recently analyzed. So when the Easton Reading 9 came to us and asked us to look at the surveys. They all existed within SurveyMonkey. There were 3 unique surveys, one for the middle school students, one for the high school students, and then one for the parents. When we got the data through SurveyMonkey, the data that we received was in fact the data that was entered into SurveyMonkey by the respondents. So when I put those N numbers there of 2040 and 284, I can say with certainty that those are unique individual surveys that were entered into SurveyMonkey. We can't speak to who completed those surveys. Obviously, they were anonymous. SurveyMonkey does not, at that level, does not collect IP address data, so we couldn't drill down to see where the results came from. But we are 100% certain that the data that we analyzed with the DEI survey through SurveyMonkey was the data that was entered into those into the portals for each of those 3 unique surveys. So when I say that the data is valid, I can say with 100% certainty that the data was not manipulated in any way on the back end after the data was entered into SurveyMonkey. I can't speak to what happened in when the surveys were filled out, but we can say that the data that we received was the actual data that was put in. Now, having said that, when you look at those response rates of 20 and 40 for the middle school and the high school and 284 for the parents, there is no statistically significant interpretations that we can make from those surveys. The sample size is just not large enough compared to the population as a whole for us to make any valid, statistically significant statements about what we saw. We can, however, look at those surveys and draw out some underlying themes, at least for those folks who responded in the surveys. And when we looked at some of the individual questions, the statistical significance that we'd be looking for would be 1. If we found that one student in either the middle school or the high school addressed topics of safety or comfort to a level where they addressed it on multiple questions, that then becomes a statistically significant result. It doesn't need to get to that 0.05 barrier because we're dealing with student safety. What we do look at, however, is that across that 24, 25 question survey, depending on which level it's at, in order for something to be deemed statistically significant and to rise to the level of discussion, the student would need to address that level across multiple questions. So the survey, as it was designed well enough for us to look at an open-ended question. And if a student identified or responded that they were bullied in some way because of a difference that they might have with other students, we then looked at that specific response and that respondent's answers to all of the other questions to try to identify other areas of concern. And the reason that you do that is you want to make sure that you're not reacting to just the student getting to the end of the survey and then putting in that he or she was bullied because of a particular trait. We know from the research that if a student feels that way, as they go through and answer questions similar to these, they will express those concerns multiple times. It won't be a single event entrance into the survey. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for larger themes and then individual students who felt addressed or aggrieved in a particular way based upon the questions that were asked within that survey. So when we look at the student survey as a whole, these are the major pieces that get teased out of that. The students feel safe and respected. They feel supported by their friends and teachers. When we look at all of the questions that go through there, and the survey asked about what their current environment was, whether they were in high school or middle school, and then what their environment was like in their previous years of schooling. So whether that be their middle school prior or their elementary school prior. And across the board, students felt safe and respected and supported above 90% of the time. So that 90% threshold, when we get to the climate survey, you'll hear that number again. But that's what we're looking for, to see a overall sense within the school culture of, in this case, feeling safe, respected, and supported. The areas where students identified feeling not welcome, the areas where students identified feeling uncomfortable. And we saw words like being teased, being bullied, being isolated. They were primarily at school events. They did not express that level of frustration in the classroom, in the hallways, in the bus waiting areas. It was primarily 98% of those were identified at school events. Middle school students felt a higher level of discomfort compared to the high school students. That is completely normal in a survey like this, and that just has to do with developmentally age-wise where middle school students are versus where the high school students are. So we did see a spike in that, but it's not unexpected given the maturity levels. So those were the general areas where we saw across the survey the key pieces there that we would identify as areas that are strengths and areas that students come through feeling a little less comfortable with. The last two come from the identification of open-ended questions compared to what we saw in the Likert scale, that levels of agreement, the frequency of events. When we compare those two to one another, this idea that there's not a lot of opportunities for students to discuss race, gender, sexual preferences within their classrooms. That was identified in the Likert scale questions. And then across multiple students, you saw students address issues where they didn't feel as if their backgrounds were represented in the curriculum that was being taught, in the instruction that was being delivered, and in the faculty and staff that was delivering that instruction to them. So that level of discomfort, that level of limited opportunity, when we look at how the students responded on this DEI survey versus some of the other surveys that we use when we're looking at school culture and we're looking at the DEI pieces, these students fell below what we would see, what we would normally see with these types of questions. It's not a one-to-one comparison because they're not the exact same questions. And we took some liberties when we looked at the larger academic pieces in those individual questions versus these, but we're fairly comfortable that the students in ER9 fell below or scored lower than what we would normally see for a school district of a similar demographic makeup. The second piece was whether these events are increasing or decreasing. The high school students felt that they were fairly consistent, that they hadn't changed over time. And the high school numbers were actually higher than what we'd see in the broader academic sense. They thought that the level of mistreatment around gender and sexual orientation had actually leveled off more so than most schools do. However, the middle school survey, the students felt that it was increasing at a higher rate than we would have expected to see. So they felt that those incidences occurred at a greater rate. You're always, for us in climate surveys, impacts of bullying are always greater in the middle school ages than they are in the high school ages. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But the fact that we saw a difference in how the middle school students responded versus the high school students is interesting because they normally in a setting, the two levels would fall above or below the mean together. And in this situation, they split. So that says something about the population of the middle school students versus the high school students. When we take that survey and then look at the parent survey that went along with it, asking similar, obviously not the same, but similar questions, 90% of the parents thought that the school did a great job of promoting academic success. 50% of parents felt that they were receiving guidance on how to talk to their students about the DEI issues. The areas where parents felt that bullying and mistreatment of their students had occurred at a greater rate than all of the others was around their political views. And then a relatively low percentage of parents' guardians felt the school encourages students to share their differences. The challenging part of analyzing the parent findings for the DEI is that we saw the parents fall into three very distinct groups, and their responses were fairly universal across the board. And there were those parents that felt like the school needed to do more. There were those parents who felt that the school was doing right where they needed to be. And then there were groups of parents who felt like the school was doing too much. And when we break out all of those results, we can basically put them into three different buckets. And then when we count out those three different buckets, it was basically 33%, 33%, 33%, how those parents fell in across the board. With such low response rates to the student survey and then the parent survey, we know that in cases similar to these, the results that we're getting are those most passionate about the issues that are being discussed. So to say that the results of what we have in either the student surveys or the parent surveys is a greater representation of the community as a whole, we can't do that with the numbers that we see in terms of the responses. But when we look at the findings, especially in the student pieces, we know that there is enough there for there to be actionable items around. It's not up to us to determine what those actions are or to make recommendations around those actions. The school community is well positioned to do that, and I believe this committee is as well. But there are pieces there that can be teased out and addressed moving forward. And when we get into a broader discussion of the climate survey, there are ways to alter the climate survey to a degree to determine if the changes that are being enacted have changed student perceptions, understanding that a DEI survey probably won't be administered again. You don't want to set up a scenario where you recommend changes and then have no way to measure if those changes are taking place. So we can talk about areas within the climate survey later on around how that might happen. But there are certainly actionable items that go in there as well. So that was a lot of the DEI pieces. Are there any questions? Any areas that I skipped over that you'd like me to go back to and look at again?
Anyone have it?
I have a question.
Wait, sorry, Beatrix. Dr. McKinnon had raised his hand first.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Heather. Dr. Glass, thank you for your presentation so far. When you mentioned that there was a community disagreement on the DEI work and it was broken in thirds, in your experience, is that similar or different than the communities that you've worked with?
You always get some kind of stratification around the views of the parents on a particular topic, especially something around DEI. In the last 10 to 12 years, it's become more pronounced. Generally, you would see, before then, for something like this, you'd see a nice normal bell curve around attitudes for things. And now what we're seeing is three distinct silos of pieces. I think the surprising thing for us is that with such a low sample size, what we expected before we did any of the analysis is that we would see 50% on one end of the spectrum and 50% on the other, because generally it's the folks that are really passionate about it. But the fact that there was that nice solid middle ground of folks who appreciated what's being done and felt as if the school was moving in the right direction. It was actually nice to see that middle piece. And we generally don't, especially in the last decade or so, around a DEI climate survey data.
Thank you.
Okay, B, you want to?
Yes, thank you for this. I did have a couple of questions, and the first one, I guess, was this is a very, very filtered presentation of the data. And one of the questions that I had was, do you have a breakout by different demographics in terms of the different, I'm trying to get a sense of how represented certain groups are in these results?
Yeah, there is a larger report that has the demographic information included on it. The results themselves were not disaggregated by those demographic groups. Generally, for us to do that for work like this, you need to get to a certain threshold within a subgroup to warrant a further discussion. And because the ends here were so low, none of the subgroups raised to that level. The only difference would have been if we had done a male-female breakdown, a male-female other breakdown, excuse me. But we didn't do it in this case just because of the kind of timing that it would take in order to do a breakdown of that. The data as it exists, cleaned and ready for anyone to do an additional analysis on it. But again, with an N this size, I'm not sure how much you would tease out of that. And then you start to get into areas where that student information becomes identifiable, and that's not something that we wanted to address. None of the data on any of the surveys that we looked at were identifiable in any way. And there would need to be a lot of forensic analysis on the back end for someone to do that. And we weren't willing to go there for this.
And when my last question was, towards the end, there were a lot of verbatim. There were three, actually, there were quite a few verbatim questions there. Were there any trends that you noticed coming out of this that are worth discussing or that you're able to comment on?
So when you say trends, what
I mean,
that
not
would
trends, but I mean, in terms of, were there any poignant points in terms of any of the commentary that were made, the comments that were made?
Right. So when we look at the analysis of open-ended questions, and we look at the analysis of the Likert questions and try to extrapolate out what the students are saying in those Likert scale versus the open-ended questions, there are some, again, with an N this small, I don't want to use any kind of definitive terms for it. There is an indication from many of the students that those who were impacted by bullying and mistreatment, those students felt as if it was enacted upon them from a place of misunderstanding. So when you read what the students wrote, a vast majority of them wrote it in such a way to make a reviewer believe that they didn't think that this situation was done to them, meaning harm. In most cases, what was happening was they were being treated differently because people didn't understand their differences. So when I think about, especially some of the middle school responses, students talked about they were different from other students and how the other students didn't understand how or why they were different. And something like that is a powerful point to look at, because that's something that can be addressed, right? Within education and professional development, there are things that can be done to address that. It doesn't appear to be a underlying sense of sexism or racism or attitudes towards sexual orientation. There were no transparent themes that ran throughout. When we look at DEI surveys that have a larger N and in communities where there are identified issues, you can very easily see a vein of going from the elementary school to the middle school to the high school, a vein of misunderstanding, and how that misunderstanding then grows towards a feeling of being different, which goes towards students feeling uncomfortable, which goes towards bullying and mistreatment. You can actually, in survey data, you can actually see that develop over time. And again, with a very small N, I can't say definitively, but in this case, there was no evidence of that underlying issue. Does that make sense? That was a lot.
Yes.
Okay.
Cheryl, you had your hand up.
Thank you. This discussion is very helpful. Two follow-up questions based on the discussion and the other questions from some of the other task force members. One is, you mentioned a comparison, the middle school versus the high school, like there's this split Is that versus Connecticut districts, or was that national?
Yeah, so right. So when we looked at it, we identified districts in New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts that were of a similar size, were of similar demographics. Some of these districts I'd worked with in the past, so I had access to their data and was used with permission just to do a comparison of it. So yeah, it was I wouldn't say Connecticut, but definitely a Northeast average. And when we do any kind of educational testing, the districts that I used here, we've used across the board. We've published those comparisons in academic pieces. So we're fairly comfortable knowing that they're representative enough.
And the same would apply for the parent comparisons, right? I know it's a larger sample size, but same comparison. Okay.
Correct. Yep.
And then just a final question, you mentioned actionable items and alluded to perhaps PD could be one of them. Did that emerge, right? And I know that's probably some of the work of the task force as well as the administration, but anything that you've seen in your other work with other districts in those states?
Yeah, just so, and again, we're not here to make recommendations on actual items. We identify things that we have known in the past have been addressed. And when I look at the results of the survey and when I look at other districts' action plans and how they've analyzed very similar data sets, professional development is one tool that they used to address that. There are a whole host of items that can be enacted, and I'm sure the committee is well aware of all of them and can do those. I just mentioned PD because that's always, when we look at what we see, that's always the number one factor. You know, anytime you can increase understanding around these topics, it's going to benefit anyone.
Thank you.
Any other additional questions on this part of the presentation? I want to say thank you. I think this is kind of, to me, fascinating at how it's sort of dovetailed with the kind of conversations that we've had over the course of the past 18 months. And then, so do you want to go on and do the analysis of the school climate survey now?
Sure, absolutely. So when we look at the school climate survey, again, it's not something that we developed. It's not something that we put forth. We only looked at 1 year's worth of data, this year's worth of data for the climate survey. So when we start talking about trends, what things mean in the grander scheme, you'd have to do an analysis of at least 5 years worth of climate survey data to see if you really have any trends. And even that now, that kind of industry standard is out the window because of what we saw with COVID. So as we discuss these, just keep that in mind, that it's just an analysis of this single data set from this year. And when we get into some of the staff stuff, a lot of that is a direct result of what we see with COVID. So when I look at the school climate survey, again, the end for this is a lot closer to what we would like to see. We analyzed 5 different surveys. So elementary schools, we combined the 2 of them together, middle schools, the 2, and then the high school, and then a parent and staff survey. Valid responses, we looked through, we cleaned any data, eliminated anything that didn't look accurate or looked as if there was a heavy chance of test fatigue, which is something that you can actually measure in a survey. And it's pretty clear, especially when you get to the elementary school kids, they will get halfway through and then kind of get bored and just click the same button the whole way through. So we want to make sure that the results that we see and that are presented in a way that makes sense. So I've done a lot of work around school climate, and kind of what the accepted view of what school climate is now falls into these 3 areas. We have engagement, we have safety, and we have environment. And when I looked at the climate surveys that were developed and delivered, I was able to fit question except for 2 into one of these groups and then subgroups. So then when we look at the questions related to engagement, relationships, respect for diversity, et cetera, what we look to see is on those Likert scale questions, where is the audience responding? So climate work, you look at a 5-point Likert scale, and you look at anything on the two right ends, which are the higher scoring ends in a traditional Likert scale. And for example, that would be like your agree, strongly agree. That would be happens often or very often. So you add those two pieces together, and what you're looking for is 90% of the respondents for that particular question. And in this case, those groups of questions to respond, agree or strongly agree. And then you say that within the school has a strong climate, right? So if 90% of the students in the elementary school, for example, addressed all the questions about relationships and said agree or strongly agree, then what you're doing works well in this school. Anything between 85% and 90% are areas that are of some concern, and then anything below 85% you would see as something that the school should address. And those parameters are pretty narrow towards the top, 90 to 100, that 85 to 90 piece. We just know over the history of school climate work that the 90% threshold is when we know that the school is doing something well. That 85 to 90%, the reason that it would be so high is because people are pretty naturally disposed to answer questions on the higher end versus the lower end. So the scale numbers are always going to be way higher than you would kind of expect to see. And then anything below 85% is something that we would think would be of concern. So it's really simple. We color code these things, and anything that's above 90, you get a green. Anything that's in that middle, you get an orange, and anything that's on the tail end of it, you get a red. So when we look at that engagement piece, the engagement piece broken down into those three categories. Each of those, ES is elementary school, MS is middle school, HS is high school, staff, and then parents. Each of those represents an individual survey. So the ES is the elementary school survey. The MS is the middle school survey. HS is the high school. The staff is the staff survey, and the parents are the parent survey. The relationships are all of the questions on the survey that we identified as addressing, and like for the students' relationships with their peers, with their teachers, with their parents, with their community. So what we see in that relationship piece is that elementary school students, middle school students, high school students, and parents all feel as if ER9 does a very strong job of building and maintaining relationships within the school. The staff felt as if this was an area in need of improvement. And you'll notice that as we go through each of these, that staff piece is going to be yellow often. And I would warn you that that's not an indication of school climate. That is a reaction to COVID. As a whole, as an academic community, yet we haven't been able to come across with a valid way to measure that at the teacher and the paraprofessional level, what the impact of COVID has actually been on overall climate. And I would venture to guess that if I were to look at climate survey data from ER9 prior to COVID, I would assume that many of those yellows would become green. And I say that because when I look at the open-ended response questions from the staff, a vast majority, more than 82% of those responses noted COVID and the effects of COVID on their teaching and on their everyday life in some way. So there is a very dramatic impact when you look at what you see at the staff level. I can tell you that having surveys and having 4 out of 5 greens out of 5 surveys is unusual. That is very high. Generally, you would see that piece being lower. And again, it's generally the middle school students that we would see as a yellow here if we compare this again to a similar audience. But we're seeing green. So that's definitely a positive. The respect for diversity piece, this is what we would expect to see. This is normal. Again, if I looked back 5 years, I would expect it to be similar to that. Elementary school students and parents almost across the board felt as if there was a tremendous respect for the diversity that takes place. Middle school, high school, and staff surveys felt as if this is an area that could be addressed. This is where when I talked earlier about the work that was done in the DEI and how that can be carried over and measured moving forward with the climate survey data, this is an area where some questions could be changed slightly to make sure that any changes that are enacted are measured. And you wouldn't have to make dramatic changes to the survey as a whole as you move forward. School participation, those are questions that address how actively engaged students are in their day-to-day lives, how actively engaged staff is with their colleagues, with their administration, and then how engaged parents feel in the process of the education of their children. And when we get to kind of key findings later on, there's going to be a parent piece that'll pop out of that, which is kind of an outlier there. But again, having 3 out of 5 greens here under school participation is slightly above average, and that's definitely a positive. When we look at safety, the emotional safety, this again gives us a broader sense of how students feel around issues of DEI. These questions on the survey or asked students about areas where they feel safe, about whether there are people that they can go to when they need to talk for the students, around whether they feel represented in the school itself. The elementary school being green is not unusual. The middle school and the high school being yellow is also not unusual. The fact that we don't see any reds across the board there is a strong indicator. Reds in an emotional safety area, especially at the elementary and middle school levels, indicate a trend towards growing issues. And we didn't see that. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm pretty certain that the middle school and high school numbers were much closer to the 90 than they were to the 85. So I feel comfortable in both of those areas. The staff piece, again, that a vast majority of that was staff expressing frustration with COVID. When we did a qualitative analysis of the data, there was a lot of, you can tease out the word frustration, you can tease out the word exhausted, you can tease out the word tired, overwhelmed. All of those things popped up when we looked at emotional safety and emotional safety questions. And then the parents being yellow, again, some of that, and not as much as with the staff, but some of that was concerns with parents around the social emotional needs of their students in response to COVID. Are my children too isolated? Are my children are falling behind because of changes in educational practice? That is not unusual. Generally, during non-COVID times, the parents would be green. Almost every district that I'm dealing with now, that parent area is yellow-orange. The elementary, middle school, physical safety piece, that deals with specifically around, do students feel safe in their environment? And you'll notice that there is an asterisk around the middle school, and the middle school fell in that 90%. There were enough responses in that middle school piece where, and again, this kind of popped out in the DEI, where enough middle school students expressed concerns around their safety at school events that it warranted discussion. So there wasn't enough to push it below that 90%. But when we looked at the Likert scale questions and then followed those students and look how they responded to the open-ended questions, there were more than a handful of students who felt as if they were unsafe at school events. So these are things outside of the traditional school day, outside of the traditional classroom. And having that high a number is unusual. And it's unusual to have that high a number and then not have that that fall below that 90% threshold. So it is something that warrants conversation. Again, that's one of the things that popped out of the DEI. But that's where the asterisk for that, or that's why the asterisk for that exists. Physical safety in the high school, again, that was in the 88 to 89%. That's not unusual. High schools are generally bigger buildings and there's less supervision. And I'm sure if we teased out those numbers even further, the students that would fall below that 90% were most likely 9th and 10th graders and not 11th and 12th graders. That's kind of traditionally how that falls. Staff, again, a lot of that is around COVID, and then parents felt very strongly that that their student or that their children, excuse me, were safe within the schools. And then for the last piece, the environment pieces, the physical environment, very similar for us when we looked at this because we didn't design the survey. A lot of those safety concerns that we just talked about, we basically used the same questions for both pieces because we couldn't tease out physical environment questions specifically. In some school climate surveys, there are questions that are specifically asked about different parts of the building or different parts of the school day. And that's where the physical environment piece would come in, but there weren't enough questions on these surveys to do that. Academic environment, all of the students felt as if they were receiving a challenging education. They all felt encouraged. They all felt that they had a strong degree of autonomy. There was discussions around their voice and choice around courses that challenged them. So they felt as if they were in an ideal environment for their learning. The staff piece, there was a great amount of pride from the staff and the work that was being done. The reason that that's yellow, again, is their response to COVID. Many teachers expressed not being able to do enough for their students because of the limits to what was put on them based upon the pandemic, and that's entirely understandable. And parents felt much the same way. A lot of that is a kind of an echo from COVID. Wellness has to do with kind of the physical wellness of the campus and the environment. Elementary school students and parents felt very strongly about it. Middle school, high school, and staff were in that middle range. Every survey that I've seen in the last 3 years, that those three middle pieces, the middle school, the high school, and the staff, when surveys are delivered like that, are always a tier lower than the elementary and the parents. So that's not unusual. And again, if I look at the numbers, the middle school number was like 87.5, the high school number was 89, and the staff one was right around 87. So those are fairly high in that middle range. That disciplinary environment piece, that deals with how students feel discipline is enacted upon them by teachers and the administration. The staff piece is how consistent that is in terms of the discipline that they give out and the discipline that they see being given out by administration. And then the parents is just a perceived view of how discipline is enacted in the entire school community. The middle school being red is not unusual. Maybe 20 to 30% of the surveys that we look at, we see that low a number from the middle school. The middle school is always the standout there. The fact that we don't see it green in the staff is surprising because generally we do. Generally the staff knows what the disciplinary measures are. And again, a lot of that is an echo of COVID. Some of that is with communication and how communication is being handled at the central office and the school level. But a majority of that, again, is COVID. So before I go on to kind of pull out the key findings from each of the surveys, does anyone have any questions on kind of the color coding for these pieces and how it kind of extrapolates out to the community that's there?
Can I speak? I do.
Sure.
Can you go back one page, please?
Sure.
One page.
Hold
Nope.
on one second. Nope. Hold on one second. Let me
Wrong
just.
way.
Yep. Let me just kill this for a second so we can make sure. It likes to jump around when I.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Okay, and the one before that, before I just wanted to make sure what I saw was correct before I asked my question.
Okay.
The previous page. Nope, the other direction.
It will not, hold on.
The other left.
Yep.
Okay, so in the beginning, when you presented the sample sizes, the respondents, number of responses, I assume that there's enough respondents for it to be looked at by the different demographics. And the reason that I asked that question is when you look at the answers that you're getting, particularly with the parent segment for things like diversity, disciplinary environment, physical safety, right? There are certain demographics in this town that are so few that lumping them all together and not breaking them out ends up, to me, silencing some of those views if we're not able to see how those different demographics differ in their response. So if you're lumping everyone's experiences as one group, I think there are certain voices that may not be accurately represented with it all lumped together.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And there is enough information there to tease out those different subgroups and how they respond to different questions, and then how those responses fit into each of these categories, and do kind of a sub-analysis of that. The resources that we put into this, the time that we had to do this didn't allow for that. But we certainly have the data, it's cleaned, and it's validated on our end. So, if the district wanted to do a deeper dive on it, we could certainly give the cleaned data back. Or if the district wanted to provide more resources for that further work to be done, it absolutely could be done. And I think it's a worthy exercise based upon what limited data we saw in the DEI and what we saw through some of these responses. Yeah, I agree.
Exactly, because absent that view, you almost sort of like not glossing over, but it covers over, and it sort of defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do in a climate survey. You need to identify problems, and this, I think, lumps it all together and presents a picture that's not necessarily perhaps accurate.
Well, what you get when you analyze a school climate survey as a whole is you are getting an average view of what's taking place within the school, right? You are 100% not getting some of those smaller subgroups, and their voices certainly aren't heard as much as what the broader community is. But I would not go as far as to say that you're glossing over what's actually happening. In any school environment, there's going to be a school culture that consists of a variety of different opinions. What you're getting here is, in a sample size this large, you're getting what that average is. But you're 100% right. You are not hearing every story.
That was my
story. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
That was my question also, but I think that you answered. If there was any sort of commonality that you could find between the people who responded, I don't want to say unfavorably, but sort of unfavorably to questions about emotional safety and physical safety. But you're saying you didn't do that analysis. But if in future we wanted to engage at Advance or a similar company to do the climate survey and do the climate survey analysis, that would be able to be presented. So if we could say among the people who said that they do not feel physically safe, they 90% of them fit into this subgroup.
Yeah. And I can't speak to how the climate survey was constructed. I can't speak to where the questions came from or how they were delivered. There are off-the-shelf school climate surveys that are widely used that give you that level of data in a portal. So the students, the staff, the parents take the survey online. There's an algorithm in the background that does all of this analysis for you almost in real time. So it's not as if you have to engage someone to create tape. You could have someone who controls this on the back end and then can do a sub-analysis breakdown. You know, if you asked me how many ninth grade female students who identified themselves as a certain race, a certain ethnicity, a certain sexual orientation, like you could do a sub-analysis in real time. It would take, you know, you can see how that particular subgroup of students answered all of these questions. So yes, it can be done. There's the software is out there to do that now. And it's always better to buy something off the shelf that's designed for that than to try to re-engineer it yourself.
Very good. All right, are we moving on? Is there another part of this, or?
Yeah, just really quickly, and I know I'm kind of running out of the time that we put in. Just key takeaways from the surveys. These are just the big picture items that come through. Number 3, physical appearance. As long as climate surveys have been done, as long as climate surveys have been analyzed going back to the mid-'80s, physical appearance has always been the #1 cause of unfair treatment. It hasn't changed. The numbers are strikingly consistent from then till now. The idea of gender and sexual orientation becoming, getting close to that is somewhat striking, and that's not just in ER9, it's kind of across the board. But that's a general sense that's taking place. Parents, again, all felt strongly that what was happening in the district was right for their students. There was a lot of conversation about kind of encouraging stories that had taken place about how certain issues had been addressed and how their students had been encouraged within the school. And then finally, the staff piece. A vast majority of the conversations around staff had to do with COVID and the impact of COVID. There was a lot of talk about communication from school leaders versus district leaders. A lot of that, again, was how they were notified of events that were associated with COVID, how they found out that a student would have been put in quarantine, the timing of that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So while that is something that is noted enough to be included here, I would not say that it is something that is overwhelmingly of concern. It's just a consequence of COVID, and it's something that we're seeing across the board in all of the surveys that we're doing now. So that's it. That's all of the climate survey pieces. Fun.
Thank you so much. I can tell you, I've been on the Board of Education for 5 years, and I've not seen this broken out this way or explained in, and I would be so curious to see that next level that you talked about. And I would be very curious to see what the results would be if it was a survey that was designed not in-house.
Looking at the survey that was delivered, it's a strong survey. It addresses all the issues that you want to address in a school climate survey. It was very long. And especially when you get some of those younger students, there were some surveys that we had to eliminate because of very obvious test fatigue. But the survey did address everything that it needed or that it should address. There are just ways to do it quicker, and then there are ways to do it where you can identify themes based upon multiple questions at the same time. And you really can't do that unless you know the math of the survey, and I just don't know enough to do that.
I think also there's an advantage. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. If you're using a survey that is used by other school districts nationwide, that you can compare how your students are doing to students in, California and Texas, and
And the CSCI kind of that's the industry standard one that a lot of people use now. It also does some measures around impacts of COVID, and it looks how responses to individual questions have changed in the last 3 or 4 years based upon what we know is taking place within schools around COVID. So, you're not really going to get that with a survey like this unless you have someone who's dedicated to analyzing it and then comparing those questions to larger scale questions. So it's not necessary. It's not a cost that the district obviously has to put out. But if there is value in looking at the school climate data and making changes based upon the data that exists within it, that certainly would be a recommendation that anyone would give to a school district these days.
Cheryl. Sorry, Cheryl.
Yep, I have just with respect to this comment, this slide that's up on the screen, the ER9 staff feel the parents who've strong. Was there a distinction between parents versus the overall communities? Or was perhaps, I'm trying to remember the climate survey. I don't know that the question is asked at a level of granularity.
So I'm sorry, which one are you,
you have the key takeaways for staff, that much of the ER9 staff feels that parents have too strong a voice. So
yes.
The question is there a distinction between parents or community members?
No.
I think the survey only goes to community members.
It only goes to,
it only goes to parents, I think.
I know, but
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, because
Right.
this is staff saying that parents are too involved in the decision-making process. But I'm wondering if that's just for parents of students in the district, or is that both communities of Reading and Easton? I don't think we asked that level of I don't think we asked that kind of question, but I was just curious.
No, and there's not a question on the survey that says specifically to what degree do parents have impact, blah, blah, blah. That comment comes out of looking at a number of the open-ended responses from staff that where they answered Likert scale questions low consistently. And then when you get to the open-end question, the open-end question basically says, why did you rate those things so low, without actually saying that? And a significant number of staff, 29, almost 29.5% of staff made a comment similar to that, or a comment that would reinforce that takeaway.
And then there was a similar, if you could go back, I think, to the student takeaway slide, that students express feelings of frustration with the diversity of thought, I guess, combined. You mentioned the physical appearance. Again, is that any numbers with respect to the frustration with diversity of thought? And is it percentage-wise, or whether anecdotal?
So that goes across a number of questions.
Okay.
So the questions on the survey ask, do students feel as if there's basically someone like them within the building? Do they feel comfortable expressing their opinions? Do they feel as if there is a voice for them when discussing issues around DEI? And when I look at those 9 questions, the average of those 9 questions, quick math in my head, is somewhere around 74 to 75%. Don't quote me on that. That's just off the top of my head, but they agreed 74 to 75% of the time, which is relatively low considering their responses to a number of the other questions.
And I think just overall comment you made on the surveys, that integration of the DEI type questions into climate. And then also that there are national, or at least regional, survey tools that I use across the country, perhaps. Do those incorporate some of the DEI type questions? And then if you do add stuff, how do you normalize the data over time, right? So this would be presumably be a baseline, but you don't have, so how do you compare year over year?
So the survey that I mentioned comes out of the National School Climate Center. The survey that they have in a number of different forms. And that just, you kind of go through and pick and choose the ones that are the most appropriate to you. It's been a couple of years since I looked at that part of the process, but you put in some of like your demographic information, where you are, how big your school district is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it prompts you to ask certain questions. And then you can add and subtract questions as you go along. And the survey itself is so mature that it revalidates every single question based upon which ones you add or subtract. You can also add your own questions, but there is no validity behind those. That would just be you gathering data for it. There are, as of last year, there is a bank of what I'll call DEI type questions. And they range in their level of, how do I say this politically correctly? They range in the level of what they're asking, especially students, to respond to. So it can be very vanilla, for a lack of a better word, if you just kind of want to get a 10,000 foot view, or it could get very granular. It can get all the way down and talk about specific genders or specific sexual orientations and how students who identify as those specific orientations feel within their school. And it's up to whoever puts the survey together to judge what would be accepted by the community at large as to which level of questions. But even the most basic level would get you some of the data that you're looking for from the DEI-like survey.
Can I ask a specific question about that? Are these surveys, are they done in a way, or could they be done in a way that's sort of progressive, so that as in real time they're calculating the data and you see this bucket is going into the red, they would then ask more granular questions about that to figure out where the problem is?
Yeah, so the CSCI, it is an adaptive test. So it does change the questions based upon the responses. Does it in real time if a student identifies an area? It's not sophisticated enough to in real time to then ask it like a whole nother subset of questions, right? It does allow students a greater opportunity to enter open-ended questions. So if a student identifies something as being disagree, strongly disagree, it'll almost immediately prompt them to talk about why they agreed or disagreed or strongly disagreed. And then that qualitative data is then dumped into another algorithm, and then you can actually mine quantitative data out of that qualitative data. And that's all done within the algorithm. It's not something that has to be done within the district. And that was just a real nerdy way of saying it's a cool thing and it pumps out a lot of very interesting data. But it's not adaptive enough yet to really get down to the root of specific issues.
Thanks. Dr. McKinnon, you had a question that I cut you off.
No, I think you somewhat, and you asked a question and we got an answer for it as well. I've used these surveys before, and Kevin, from what I've used in the past, you're almost choosing modules of questions that have already been research tested, and there's degrees of reliability and validity in those modules. And depending on what you're looking at, you can identify certain modules to make up your survey. And then the advantage of doing that is that you can get kind of local, state, and national norms, and then you can disaggregate and drill down into smaller slices as you go. And of course, you can add your own questions, and you may not have kind of reliable data on those questions in the first 1 or 2 years that you administer the survey. But if you administer the same questions over a period of time and you have a large enough N, then you can actually start looking at inter-rater agreement and start evaluating those questions yourself over time. So, but there are very useful tools out there which allow you to kind of go deeper.
Were there any other questions from anyone on the task force? I don't see anybody raising their hand in the. So thank you so much. That was, I think that was really, really helpful.
Great. My pleasure.
All right, thank you so much. So then we will be moving on to the next item on our agenda, which is the administration update. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pearson-Ugal.
Thank you. I do have an update. Since we met last, there have been a number of activities that have taken place. I'd say they fall into three major categories. One is communication, the other is professional learning, and then the third has to do with the activities of the building level climate committees. So in terms of communication, a number of things are happening on the ER9 website. The first has to do with our technology director and director of digital learning doing a review of all of our websites with respect to ADA compliance and the ability of a non-English speaker to be able to translate what's posted on all of our websites, which of course is critically important. So that is a fairly comprehensive analysis that's taking place, and a number of changes will be occurring in the months ahead to replace some of the things that have been posted as pictures, which then cannot be moved through a translation tool into something that can be scanned and translated. So I think that will be a great support to some of the members of our community. And the second has to do with, similar to the launch of the curriculum website, we are going to also launch a climate website. And the climate website, we hope, will make climate activities more transparent, more readily available to parents, to staff, to students, to community members. And that will include the revised Safe School Climate Plan. And when I say revised, I mean after all three boards take action on revisions to the climate policy that includes some updates from the state in terms of the bullying definition and a number of other changes. That will prompt a need to change to the Safe School Climate Plan, which contains all those definitions. So the district climate committee will gather together to draft those revisions. And once those are finalized, that will be posted on that climate website. The climate website will also include links to all relevant district policies that include climate information. So that has to do with bullying, discrimination, bias, gender identity, the various titles and the policies that are attached to them. Also links to incident reporting tools. Those are available on all of our school websites currently, but we want there to be sort of a one-stop place for people to find things without having to make too many clicks. And then finally, resources for parents. There are a lot of things that occur in our schools, and also methods that we use to resolve conflict between students. And we want parents to understand those practices more, provide more information. So as an example, restorative practice is something that we talk about in our schools as a way of bringing two people together to address differences, address conflict in a way that is not merely punitive, is not a matter of identifying one person who's been wronged and another person who's right, and then making punishment the only way to solve a problem. So we want to provide more information to parents about restorative practice, as well as some of the social and emotional programs that we have in place in our schools that help students to solve problems and address conflict when it comes up over the course of their school experience. In addition, in terms of communication, we have moved forward with the monthly communications to the Board of Education and the members of the Building Climate Committee, and most notably the climate specialist, who's also the assistant principal, is providing monthly updates to the staff, just keeping everyone in the loop of the activities so that even if a staff member doesn't serve on the climate committee, they're kept abreast of what's happening in those meetings. So I'm pleased to share that in all 5 buildings, they've had their first meeting of their building climate committee, talked really at great length, from what I understand, about the definition of a positive school climate, what that entails, and how all of the members of the committee can support that work. In most cases, they either identified areas of focus or goals at the school level, which go back to supporting the district level goals, which I shared at our last meeting. Let's see, at the elementary level, the students don't sit directly on those building climate committees, but there's a link through the assistant principal to some type of a student leadership group. It might be student government, it might be some type of a fourth grade program or fifth grade program where students have a leadership opportunity. And so that's how they're engaging the students in the building climate committee at the elementary level. And finally, professional learning. Since we met last, there's been some anti-bullying PD for staff and also a parent session for middle school parents. There is about to be an English learner teaching and inclusion strategy PD experience for staff members at one of our schools. And we've talked about providing our board members a presentation about restorative practices so that all of our board members also have a better understanding of that approach to address conflict in all 5 buildings. And then finally, I would say that our work with Dr. Glass really represents an opportunity for us to expand professional development in this area. I know that I learned a great deal by listening to him, and I can also recognize what I certainly can't do myself or what we lack in terms of capacity within our district, but would certainly benefit from hiring an outside expert in this area to help us moving forward, to help us to really examine the content and the construction of our surveys, and then to determine whether we should use a survey that has already been normed and accepted, and just be sure that we remember that we do have questions from the state of Connecticut that we must ask on our climate surveys. So I would really encourage us to think about continuing our work with an outside consultant in this area and continuing our climate survey work so that we have a better understanding of both the construction of the survey, the content. He talked about the sort of survey fatigue, and that was helpful information. And then finally, the analysis and his ability certainly to analyze goes beyond what we would be able to do internally. I'm happy to take any questions. I would say there are many activities are going on, and I've certainly heard very positive feedback from the building climate committees as well.
Does anyone have any questions? Jenny.
Stephanie, thank you. The presentation was amazing, and I absolutely agree with your analysis and Beatrix's comment and Heather's comment. If we have the ability to take that deep dive sooner rather than later, I mean, it sort of seems like the whole point, right, of doing it. So would certainly support that. And I guess I'm just curious about, like, we earmarked and approved monies in our budget for a consultant for DEI work and for climate work. So I don't know if this is just an Easton specific question or if it was also approved in Reading as well, and sort of where are we with that, and how does this presentation tonight versus future consultant work, and maybe kind of an update as far as expenditure against those amounts that were approved. Mm-hmm. And if I'm really being clear, just kind of where are we? Yeah. Is that still sufficient, what we approved? Do you need more in order to take the next step with this survey? Just kind of, what do you need from us going forward, and where are we with the budget that was already approved for this?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So there is money in the operating budget in all 3 districts to continue consulting work under the general umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So given the transition that we've had in central office in the last 3 months, we've had 3 different superintendents. I have discussed with an outside consulting group that would be new to us. I've had a number of discussions with this group and discussed it with Dr. McMorrin and more recently with Dr. McKinnon. And so we have a proposal, we are considering a proposal, and I look forward to continuing those discussions and hopefully putting a contract into place very soon. So that DEI consulting work would continue what has already been done. So the districts are in slightly different places. So I needed to find an organization that could be responsive to work that has occurred in separate buildings, and then also help us to advance sort of as a system. So really working with the leadership team specifically, but also, for instance, we have not yet really conducted a thorough review of our curriculum to identify areas of strength and then raise some questions so that if there are any changes that need to occur, that's guided from an expert. So that's certainly an area of interest. So yes, there is money within the operating budget, and I hope that in our next meeting, I should have an update on that.
Cheryl.
Thank you. That was a very, very helpful update, Stephanie. And just to follow up on Jenny's comment, I do support the continued work as well. So I'm glad to hear that there's that ongoing effort. I guess to that point, a few people mentioned just getting deeper into the nuances of some of the survey findings, and just thinking about some of the past climate survey findings, right? The outliers or the responses that are less in quantity, but still resonate, right? Is that part of the continued work with respect to Barlow? In other words, I would like the responses to be additive, not just re-summarizing a higher level set of responses.
Yeah, so, we appreciate and value the analysis that was conducted by Dr. Glass, absolutely. Our own district level climate team also went through all of the responses to both surveys, the DEI survey as well as the climate survey. And for the open-ended questions, the leaders in each school took careful note of some of the responses that prompted questions in their own mind in terms of the need for possibly some professional development exercises or opportunities for students to share their experience and have a voice to speak up. So where students identified specific areas where they noticed more unkind behavior or didn't feel comfortable, then that's something that's actionable by our school leadership team. And so as an example, so at the high school, one of their areas of focus is being sure that every student can identify a trusted adult in the school community. So again, really looking at relationships and being sure that that sense of emotional safety is a top priority for us. And that is an area of focus in that building in particular.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Jenny.
Again, direct me back to our regular meeting in Easton if this is too specific, but I was really curious and struck by the responses related to safety at school events, and within the context of, just thinking about student privacy, and if we drill down too deeply, are we, revealing the identities of individual students? But I guess, is that being looked at the school level? And I know, John, we've been kind of trying to think more about, board governance, board versus board involvement. Is that information that you think the board should have or consider, or do we just sort of leave that in your hands to dig deeper into?
Yeah, I think you can feel comfortable in knowing that our administrative team has looked at every single survey response. And so when there was enough information for us to take action, we certainly did take action. As Dr. Glass explained, there were the responses generally did not fall into a category of students stating that they didn't feel safe. It was more that they didn't feel well understood. So when you think about the types of activities that we have available for our students at the high school level, there are a number of activities that might take place on the school campus that are not necessarily during the school day. So you think of athletics, clubs, musical performances. So those are times we know are less supervised, but knowing that students are making comments allows the leadership team to discuss with students. Again, remember, students are active participants on the climate committee. What do we need to be doing to improve this information, to improve the sense of safety that students are remarking on? When we get to the middle school level, sometimes the comments make reference to activities that are not necessarily school-sponsored activities. That said, it's still helpful information for us. So it's something that we want to monitor. In terms of board action, I think that if I could clearly identify, we need an additional person to provide supervision in X area, because there is so clearly, for instance, things that are being noted at recess time or things that are, then I would absolutely be coming to the board and saying, this is something for your discussion during a budget meeting.
Thank you, Stephanie. I mean, as much as we can kind of continue to unblur the lines and, help us to really identify our role and how we can specifically support what you're doing and sort of also not be in the way, it's really helpful. So thanks for indulging the question.
Devin.
Just a couple quick comments. So one, thank you for this presentation. I think it was really helpful and insightful. It's the first time I think we've dug into climate data. It's the first time we've done a DEI survey. But we've done climate surveys for years, and having that analysis, I think, is really helpful. I will say, I think with budget season always approaching and always I think we should really start to think about the use of a third-party tool. There's just so much value that can come out of that, and it's relatively inexpensive, especially when we consider, as Dr. Glass was talking about, just the ability to very easily with a dashboard go in and look at data, chunk data into different subgroups, be able to understand how questions tie together, very similar to the analysis that was done, and then also look at how our data compares to other schools in Connecticut and other schools nationally. I think it would be a really worthwhile investment. So just as we think about those recommendations, I just want to make sure that we're doing that ahead of budget time so that it's something that gets into our overall budget. And then I think in terms of the climate work that is happening in the schools, I'm just really happy to see that work happening really where it matters so much. It's really close to students, and you have people in those buildings who understand the culture, the students, and that work happening in the building. And then, us learning about that work and being able to inform the budget feels like the right process versus, us kind of pushing down. Like the push up is a much better and I think really thoughtful process. So thank you, Stephanie, for making a lot of very fast and transformative changes to that overall process. It's appreciated.
Beatrix?
I have a question to follow up on what Devin said in terms of getting a research, committing to an analysis tool. Aren't we already able to do that through our subscription with SurveyMonkey? It allows a certain number of cross tabulations to just automatically be generated.
I think it's my understanding that it's not just, it's finding an existing survey that then will allow us not only to cross tabulate between ourselves, but we're using a resource and an outside organization to do the analysis of that for us, rather than like what has happened in the past. It's sort of, we've created our own climate surveys, and as he was saying, like they're very long, and it doesn't give us the ability to compare.
But so this would be for normative data then, okay?
This would be for the school climate survey.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think too, just in being able to have a survey that has some reliability and validity to it, that has been validated by a third party, so that those questions, the wording of those questions have been researched, and when you get an answer, you know that it actually is valid in terms of the response. I think, and it also just saves, I think, a lot of potential angst and time in terms of having a survey that we know we can feel really good about the validity and of those responses.
Okay. And it allows us to compare ourselves to other schools or other regions.
Yeah, and also, you know, the work of the school level climate committees has been amplified so much. And I have so much gratitude for you, Dr. Pearson-Ugal, for taking this on so enthusiastically, because it's a tremendous amount of work that you were not doing before. And it really, I want to reiterate what Jenny said, which was that the work of the boards of education should be to support this work and not get in the way of it. And I think that, you know, we all board members know that we're supposed to be taking a 30,000-foot view, and that we sort of stepped in because a problem was presented to us. And from my takeaway from what was presented tonight was that the problem that was presented to us is a legitimate problem, and it is ongoing, and it is not terrible. It's not terrible, but it definitely warrants the continued focus on this. And in terms of like board, what Jenny said, again, board governance versus board involvement, I would like to see this work pushed forward into the school level building climate committees, because each school has a different set of needs. Each school isn't starting from the same place, same rung on the ladder, or with the same sets of needs. So it's not really, I don't think really the best use of anybody's time to be looking at something over the whole district when the real work can be happening at that school level. Thoughts? I mean,
it sounds like that's what's being done. I mean, I think that's what Stephanie's update told us, is that that's absolutely what's happening. They have totally taken the reins. They have got this. And we just need to listen for updates and be ready to push resources in their direction when they request them.
There were several takeaways that I had from that presentation. Number one, I liked what he said about the one student is statistically significant enough for actionable items to be built around that one student's response. And that is something that we have been saying all along, that this was, particularly the DEI survey, was not meant to be quantitative, it was meant to be qualitative. And the other thing that I thought was very interesting is that he thought, in terms of the parent response, that it was in thirds. There was 1/3 of people who thought we weren't doing enough, 1/3 who thought we were doing just right, and 1/3 thought we were doing too much. So I take that as being 2/3 want us to keep doing this or more. So that's how that was how I interpreted that. The charge of the task force was to make recommendations, and we made a list of recommendations based on our conversations. And I would think that based on tonight, the presentations and the conversation after the presentations, that 2 additional recommendations would be for the school climate committees to continue this work supported by the boards of education through professional development, and that those committees would then report to this committee for oversight and accountability, and also to say, you know, at Helen Keller, we really need somebody to do this. And then the board members from this committee take that into their budget discussions.
So you want school-based climate committees to come to this committee to then report back to the board? I'm trying to follow.
Okay, so my recommendation would be that this group would meet, say, 4 times a year to hear reports from the school climate committees. And those reports would be used in terms of the normal business of the board, governance, budgeting. That would be a way for the school climate committees to say, we need more resources for A, B, C, and D. And then the board members serving on this task force take that to their boards like a regular committee for into budget discussions. Does that make sense? You're trying to write it down.
It makes sense on its face. I just see Jenny's hand up. I was going to defer to her.
Yeah.
I just think that what you're describing should be the decision and steered by Dr. McKinnon and Dr. Pearson-Ugal and not by this committee. Basically it, you know, how they want to aggregate the information and push that out to us, you know, and sort of organize that structure and that flow of information should come from them.
I think Heather, what I heard, and Jenny, what I heard Heather just say was that school level committees, school districts have had school-based committees and a district overall climate committee for some time. It's part of the legislation. And we've always explored data and studied data. I've certainly done that in numerous other districts. We've never really explored that data and discussed the data in the light, right, in the public. We've kind of done that in our school-based teams. And I think what I heard Heather say is that the school climate committees and our curriculum committees and so on continue with this work in the way that we have with the training that Dr. Pearson-Ugal described earlier, and that we report our progress back to you at checkpoints throughout the year. It's kind of what I heard you say. And almost the idea of, instead of, if you think of a series of concentric circles, almost like a target or a bullseye, instead of operating from the outside in towards the middle, the outside being the community and the board and the parents and the students being in the middle, that you would actually operate from the inside out, starting with the students, starting with the data, looking at what they need, and then start developing experiences and having those conversations in our classrooms, and then expanding that work outwards through our climate committees, and then again providing those regular checkpoints to the task force. Perhaps that's 4 times a year, as you explained. That's kind of what I took away from that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because, you know, outside of assessing our strengths and weaknesses as a district, the next level of that is what happens in the actual schools, and what that work is going to be is specific to each building. And I don't think that as members of a board of education, I don't really think that that's our role to get that involved in what's happening inside each classroom. That's for the school climate committee and the curriculum committee to determine. And we have now those groups have been sort of beefed up. I hate that expression, but you know what I mean? There's more parents, there's students involved in that. A lot of the same people who serve on this task force are now serving on their school climate committees. So it's a way for each building to address their own specific needs. And then this group would provide the support for that through the governance of the boards of education.
So throwing a little bit of a flag on the play here, because I think we're starting to stray outside of the agenda. And I think this is absolutely in bounds for, you know, perhaps November meeting or December meeting, talking about, especially when we're talking about the schedule and all that. So I think something we want to notice. And make sure we bring back as a part of an agenda.
So an agenda item would have to be to make the recommendations.
Right. And I mean, it's contingent upon any committee to determine the regular meeting schedule. Right. So we would need to do that. Generally, that's going to be a December, January thing.
The meeting schedule is, we're now in October. So the meeting schedule, I think, goes through November, December. Is it scheduled beyond that? I don't.
So you do it a year at a time. You publish your regular meeting schedule, and that's a really important sort of component of it. You really want to do that in sort of December, January. January, they give you a deadline. What is it? It's like January 25th, Chris.
So it would make sense to me. Like here's the other flag, is that there's going to be new people,
right? And they should be a part of that conversation.
They should be a part of that conversation, but how to make recommendations if you've not been part of these conversations?
Yeah, here.
Is the question. Tricky. Yep. So could we have a special meeting?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, we can definitely do that. I just think, sort of making sure that we're noticing that conversation, because it's important and it's work we have to do anyways.
Yeah, I mean, just personally, one of the other recommendations I would want is to engage the use of an outside climate survey and someone to do the analysis. This was so helpful. I see Floriska, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've just been, listening attentively. There is a negative tone in the community regarding this work. And I am particularly sensitive to the group of people who believe that, we shouldn't do this work or we should leave things as is. And this work is so important. I want to implore on all of us to figure out a way to have some type of community conversation, because this type of work, I don't think we should move forward without including everyone. I mean this like from the bottom of my heart. The tone, the comments that are going around, we just cannot continue. I don't think we can continue to do this work and have the success that we want without a few community conversations to get everyone to express their whys, their fears, their reservations, whatever it is they're feeling and thinking. I think it's time that we give everyone an opportunity to lend their voice to this conversation so that we can move forward in a really meaningful way so that our work will have impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What wasn't that one of our previous recommendations?
I can't hear you.
Oh, I think it was one of our previous recommendations that the schools would initiate that. I don't have that on.
I can't hear you.
Can everyone else hear me?
Oh. I can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, so I think, does anyone remember in the list of recommendations that we made previously? I think that was on there.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely. And I also think that it is something that should be happening in the community, like beyond the schools.
Yeah.
Yep, there was a discussion regarding how members of the task force could partner with the parent organizations in each of the districts, possibly even at the school level, to really talk about how to advance that in a way where people would feel emotionally safe and most likely to actually engage in a way that was productive. And I will say honestly, I I think there is some hesitation because many people feel that it would perhaps be best done through a skilled facilitator, that these are just difficult conversations to have, especially right now. And as much as many individuals are really well-meaning and would love to just open up a conversation, it's sort of easier said than done.
Yeah, especially given that one of the points that he raised was that, or that was brought out in the survey, was how many people felt, I guess, vulnerable because of their perspective, their point of view.
I know I'm being Mr. Parliamentarian. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that we're within the bounds of the agenda. I think we're getting into committee member comment. Yeah.
So
but Beatrix may have had something.
Yeah, Beatrix, do you have something on the agenda?
I did. I just wanted to say I couldn't agree more with what Floriska said. And I know I've been having those conversations myself and trying to engage people and making them feel comfortable having those conversations. But I will reiterate what I've said before. It's kind of hard to have those conversations when we're not breaking out the data to show where the issues are, in which segments of the community have those issues. You can't on the one hand say we need to have this conversation, then lump all the data that shows, oh, parents feel good about diversity. You have to actually show the pain points. So if we're not willing to do that, you have to put yourself in both sides' feet. Then they look at it and they say, but I looked at this data. It said parents were fine. So if we're not going down to that level and saying, but you know what, the reason we're doing this is because we have heard from certain marginalized communities that they're not having the same experiences. If we're not bringing the data down to that level, people look at us as this work does not need to be done. We are contradicting ourselves. So we have to look at the data down to those levels. Otherwise, don't even have the conversations, because what the data I saw tonight said a lot of the things that we said that we as a community claimed to be problematic did not show that, because we grouped the marginalized communities with the majority. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I agree that I think a deeper dive is necessary there to really uncover that. It sounds like we do have that ability, and something we should be looking at for an agenda item for an upcoming meeting. And it sounds like there's also recommendations about how we can do that in even more meaningful and nimble ways in the future. I think that's really promising, some kind of dashboard that gives us that ability. So I think that's all really promising, and I would highly recommend we look at future agenda items for that.
Chris Parkin.
I was just going to suggest, as a way to try to bottom out and move on the agenda, to perhaps agree on some sort of special meeting between now and the middle of November, and ask the administration to reflect on this discussion and the presentation and think about what makes sense from their perspective as far as a meeting cadence and a reporting structure and things like that. Because what I don't want to be doing is creating meetings for the sake of creating meetings, or imposing burdens for the sake of imposing burdens, when we can all work together to find a right solution, and we shouldn't do it sort of on the fly.
Yeah, I agreed. And that would be a real tight agenda on that one, promise. Okay, so we are, I keep muting myself. We are moving on then to the next item on the agenda, public comment. If there's any members of the public who would like to speak, I ask that you unmute yourself and you limit your comments to 3 minutes to items that were on the agenda this evening. Nobody. Oh, can they unmute themselves? Can they raise their hand? Yeah?
They can raise their hand.
Anyone should be able to raise their hand. Yep.
All right, seeing none. Oh, wait. Who was that?
Dana Benson.
That's Dana Benson.
Dana Benson.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just a couple comments. On the DEI survey, I was really surprised to hear Dr. Glass, and once again, he was great. But he was very, very circumspect and careful about the DEI survey data. He was very careful to say this, he could only warrant that the data was entered. The data that was entered was not manipulated after it was entered. So that means once it moved from the level of someone filling out the survey into administrative hands, it was not played with, which is very important, and not that we would expect that, but that's what he said. What he didn't say, he made no comment, and I guess he was not able to, was on the data security of the stuff that was put in. In other words, we talked about this previously where there were holes in the survey and people were able to take it multiple times. And I think it's just important to not forget that and to not say, okay, even though we got 20 out of 350 middle school students, 3% responded to this, and 40 out of 815 high school students responded to the DEI survey, less than 5%, that we can, and what he said was these were not statistically significant numbers to base conclusions or actions upon. What he did say is we can look at the individual responses in the open-ended, this is what I heard. We can look at the open-ended questions and we can tease out areas for action. And I think it's important to keep that in perspective. We still have to address, and I think it's great to get a guy like Dr. Glass in to conduct the surveys if you're going to do another one, a separate DEI survey. I think it's wiser to drop it in, as Devin Weibel had suggested on a previous meeting, instead of doing 2 surveys, to do 1 and incorporate the DEI aspects to the extent you want to into the climate survey. Because that's another element of test fatigue. But the important thing is, I think, data security, and that I think an outside consultant would help with that. So the chair lady had mentioned 1/3 of the parents said the school was doing enough, 1/3 said the school was not doing enough, and 1/3 said the school was doing too much in this area. It's just as equally logically valid to conclude from that maybe we should stay with what we're doing, or putting the middle together with the other extreme, the people don't want this or don't want the extreme versions of this.
Can you wrap it up? It's been 4 minutes.
Right. So I thought it was really good to hear. It looked like we scored well when we go to the climate survey, which was statistically significant. That the students who felt bullied would be, felt that it was not they were bullied to be inflict harm. It was done because other students didn't understand how they were different. I think that's positive. I also liked his conclusion that there doesn't seem to be an underlying theme of racism, sexism, or non-tolerance of gender differences in the school climate survey. So it looks like we're scoring pretty well. Thank you very much.
Any additional public comment? Okay, seeing none, board member comment. John Riley.
Thanks, Heather. At our last Reading meeting, we talked a lot about, and we looked at a lot of data with regards to the academic performances of our students. And tonight we were, looking at a couple different sets of data that help us better understand the social and emotional aspects of our students. And I think that given what's happened in the last 2 years, I think there's probably nothing that we really need to be paying more attention to than the social and emotional well-being of our students and our staff as well. I hear it all the time, including at home, that this year has been even more difficult for teachers than the previous year. So I think that continuing to look at data and trying to better the environment for our students and for our staff is key. As we mentioned here too, we're going to see a changeover in our boards and on this committee. And I hope that these committees and boards will continue to make checking in and using data to better understand the environments for our students, so that we can continue on that road and help out students who've been in a difficult predicament for 2 years. And I trust that that will take place with the new folks coming onto the respective boards. Thanks.
Thanks. John Stinson.
Thanks, Heather. I'll be brief. I just wanted to respond to the public comment made about 30 seconds into this meeting that we should, I think if you go back and look in the YouTube video, somebody said, look at these F-bomb idiots. I don't know who they're talking about because I look here and I see several PhDs. I see lawyers and educators and a bunch of really, really smart, thoughtful people volunteering their time to try to do work to help our communities. And I think that tone and that sentiment is not well placed here. And I think they're wrong. And I think they should apologize. But I don't think that they will. So I just want to say, I think you're all doing a great job. And I think what you're doing matters. I think every single person that's a part of this committee who attended tonight and spoke up contributed in a really meaningful way to making our schools better for every student. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Chris?
Just briefly, in the event that we do not schedule a special meeting between now and the 16th or 17th of November, when the boards turn over, I want to thank the board members who are turning over and will be leaving this work as a result of that for their hard work as sort of inaugural members of this committee through immeasurable challenges of the past year and a half. John and particularly Heather, who has taken on the chairmanship of this committee and dealt with substantial headwinds throughout. Just my appreciation for enduring what you've done to push this work forward.
Thank you, Chris. Devin?
Sorry, somebody was calling my phone. I couldn't figure out how to get unmuted while it was ringing. I also just want to, I think it's been a really challenging year or so since this committee was formed. But I think through challenge, we often accomplish really important things. And so I just wanted to acknowledge, one, that this has been really, really hard, but I think extremely important. And then two, thank the members of this task force, especially Heather, because this was something you championed because of a need that was identified by students in our community, something that they felt was really important, that, you know, as a community that we come together as a tri-board and discuss, you know, things that they felt were not being adequately addressed in their schools, and making sure that our communities are safe and meet the needs of each of our kids. And so while it has been really hard, and I think at times, I know many of us have probably thought that we should leave this service work because we are volunteering our time. And as John mentioned, you know, some of the activity that happened early in this meeting has been something that many of us have endured, or that kind of sentiment that we have endured for, you know, 14 months, and it has made many of us not feel exactly welcome and safe in our own community. But this work is extremely important because it's vital to our kids feeling safe in school and also being able to achieve academically, because when we feel safe, when we feel seen, when we feel represented in our classroom, we do better in school. And so I just want to thank each of us for being here, and thank Heather, because I know this might be your last meeting, and I think I appreciate your hard work, your dedication, and your fierce attitude when facing adversity. So thank you.
Thank you, Devin. Anyone else? I'm gonna make sure we have another meeting, by the way. Todd?
I thought I saw Todd trying to get you.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in as well and say thank you both to Heather and John for chairing these meetings and getting us to this point. So thank you. And to all the other committee members as well, but specifically to the chairs. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Jenny, did you have your hand up?
Sorry, I couldn't find my button. I need to update my system. I don't have all the same buttons that you guys do. I still don't have a hand raise thing. I am super late to this work as an official committee member, but Heather, you're going to be missed. I feel like I've learned a lot from you, and hope that you don't stay too far away, so we can, continue to work with and learn from you. I think that on a sort of a separate note, we're definitely making progress towards that idea of governance versus involvement. And with the turnover in board members and leadership as things kind of evolve over the next month or two, I would like to see us revisit the charge of the committee with the feedback of our new administrators, people that are new to us in central office, and new board members, and just the experiences and challenges of the past year. Because I think there might be some benefit to taking a look at that, and possibly more refinement and streamlining that we can do there. And I just wanted to thank, I don't know where she went, Floriska, for turning on your video for a moment, because that truly was the first time I've ever actually seen your face and what you look like. So I sort of feel like I met you tonight. So thank you for that.
You should hear her sing. Any other task force member comment? Okay, seeing none. Like I said, I'm going to make sure we get that meeting on the books, because I have one more in me. But just in case, I do want to say that this definitely has been a challenge, but I have left every single one of these meetings feeling uplifted and positive, and like I have learned from all of you. And I want to thank you all for that. I want to thank every kid who sent me an email, who reached out to me, alumni who reached out to me, who said thanks. And I want every one of you to know that I firmly, fully believe that this work is going to continue, and it's going to continue in the right way, with the right people holding it in their hands. And I am not going far. I still live where I have always lived. So I am fully planning on scheduling that special meeting, because we do have recommendations and there is a little bit more work to do, and we can make that happen, I think. So is there a motion to adjourn?
I think Jenny's trying to say something.
Oh, Jenny?
Super quick, Heather, I feel bad saying anything right on the tail end of your departing comments, and I apologize for that, because that was the most important thing to hear tonight. John, just to quick note, a side comment connected to what you mentioned before about the inappropriate comments in the community. I think that that's in large part to our presence on Zoom. And if we could please get back in person as soon as possible, I think that we would avoid quite a bit of that conflict and unwelcomed negative participation. So yeah, that's all.
Yeah, that rings true.
Agreed. Okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Make the motion.
John, Devin, meeting is adjourned at 9:02 p.m. Thank you so much.